Elena folded the letter slowly, smoothing the creases with her fingers as if it were something sacred. The ink was faded, the edges worn, but Thomas's words still clung to her heart. "Soon, my love," he had written. "Soon we'll walk the riverbanks again, like nothing ever changed." But the letters had stopped coming. It had been weeks now. No word. No explanation. The silence wrapped around her tighter than the winter chill that crept through the broken windows of the hospital where she worked. She kept herself busy. Wounds to clean, bandages to change, names to remember and forget. But the nights were different. Quiet. Heavy. And that's when she noticed Luca. He barely spoke when he arrived, just another wounded man with tired eyes and too many scars. But something in his stillness mirrored her own. He listened when others talked, watched when others looked away. And when he finally spoke to her, it was about poetry. Not pain, not loss, but words that lingered, like Thomas's once had. She told herself it was nothing. Just the war. Just the ache of missing someone for too long. But when she handed Luca his medicine and their fingers brushed, something paused in her, a flicker. The kind of flicker that didn't belong to a married woman. She retreated quickly, retreating behind duty and silence. But the flicker didn't die. Every day she told herself Thomas would return. That the letters would come again. That hope was enough. But the days kept passing, and the hollow in her chest grew. Luca never asked questions. He never pressed. But when he looked at her, he looked as if he already knew. One evening, after a long shift, Elena found herself outside, alone under the half-light of a bruised sky. Luca stepped beside her, not saying a word. They stood like that, still, breathing in a moment that should never have existed. She wanted to speak, to confess something, but her voice stayed buried. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed her a piece of paper. A poem. Not written by some distant author, but by him. Her fingers trembled as she read it. Not because it was beautiful, though it was. But because it felt personal. Too personal. A line read, "I found peace in someone who still waits for someone else." She looked up at him, startled, but he was already walking away. That night, she didn't read Thomas's last letter. She held it for hours, unopened. Her guilt grew louder, but it was not just for Luca, it was for the doubt she could no longer deny. Thomas was a ghost in ink. Luca was flesh and breath and warmth. She went to bed without lighting the candle. The next morning, a telegram was delivered to the hospital. The nurse at the front handed it to Elena with wide eyes. Her hands shook as she opened it. Private Thomas Keller, missing, presumed dead. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just folded the telegram and walked outside, into the frost. The telegram sat untouched on her dresser for days. Elena neither moved it nor acknowledged it. Grief had not arrived with it, only a strange, hollow clarity. The silence that once tormented her now felt justified. She stopped waiting. The absence had become fact, not fear. Luca remained at the hospital, his recovery slow but steady. He no longer flinched at her presence. Their conversations became effortless. They spoke of books, music, things untouched by war. She stopped mentioning Thomas, and Luca never asked. Instead, he told her about his mother's bakery in Milan, about the almond pastries she used to make on Sundays. He described the taste so vividly, she could almost smell them. Her ring stayed on, but it meant less with each passing day. Not out of disrespect, but because memory was no longer stronger than reality. Her hands remembered how it felt to be held. Her heart remembered what it meant to be noticed, not just loved, but seen. The first time they kissed, it wasn't planned. She brought him a second blanket during a particularly cold night, and he looked at her the way Thomas once had, years ago, when everything was new. The kiss was brief, hesitant, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. She pulled away, ashamed. But he didn't follow, didn't try to excuse it. He simply said, "I'm sorry," and turned away. That restraint hurt more than if he'd begged her to stay. Elena avoided him for a week. Not out of anger, but fear of what she was becoming. The guilt curled around her like smoke. But the guilt was not about Thomas, it was about how little she mourned. She realized she had been grieving long before the telegram arrived. Thomas had left her long before war took him. One night, unable to sleep, she returned to the drawer where she kept his letters. She read the oldest one. He had written it when they were still newlyweds. It was full of promises, full of certainty. She couldn't recognize the handwriting anymore. The words felt foreign, like a language she no longer spoke. Luca came to her 2 days later with news. He had been cleared to leave the hospital. His injuries had healed. He would return south, to help rebuild. He told her without expectation, without pressure. "I don't want to be a chapter you regret," he said. "If this was just comfort, say so." She didn't respond. Not then. She just watched him walk away again, same as before. But something inside her shifted. A decision began to form, not out of passion, not out of grief, but out of the truth she had buried beneath hope. Elena realized she had clung to Thomas's memory out of habit, not love. What she had with Luca wasn't betrayal, it was the first honest feeling she had experienced in years. And for that, she could no longer pretend to be just a widow in waiting. Elena stood in the hallway when she heard the voice. Familiar. Hesitant. Her blood turned cold. She turned slowly and saw Thomas, thinner, pale, a scar tracing his jawline. Alive. Breathing. Real. The telegram had been wrong. He looked at her like a man expecting joy, but her face stayed still. No tears. No smile. Just stunned silence. He stepped forward, arms slightly raised, unsure. She didn't move. He noticed. They spoke that evening, but it felt like conversation with a stranger. His voice was rougher, his eyes distracted. She waited for his explanation, for something to anchor her emotions. He offered none. Only fragmented stories, shallow reflections. She asked why he hadn't written. He hesitated. Then, without apology, admitted it. There had been someone else. A French woman. A quiet town, a temporary posting. He said her name like it didn't matter. Claimed it was meaningless. That the war had made him forget himself. That loneliness had taken over. He expected forgiveness. Familiarity. She gave him neither. Elena listened, not with anger but with detachment. The betrayal didn't burn, it numbed. It made sense now. The silence. The change in tone in his last letters. She had blamed war. Distance. But it had been him. Choice, not chance. When she told him about Luca, his face changed. A flicker of disbelief, then offense. As if her betrayal outweighed his. He raised his voice, accusing her of giving up, of moving on too easily. She didn't respond. There was nothing left to defend. The next morning, Thomas confronted Luca outside. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to draw attention. Luca didn't retaliate, didn't explain. He only nodded once, then left. Elena found him later, packing the few things he had. He told her he was leaving as planned. That he never expected to stay. Not after Thomas returned. She asked him to wait. Not out of desperation, but because she needed clarity. He looked at her, eyes steady. "This isn't about me, Elena. It's about what you believe you owe him." That night, Elena sat alone, trying to decipher what was left of her marriage. She no longer felt bound by vows, only by the weight of what once was. Thomas had returned with his body, but not his heart. Whatever they had shared had been buried in a country neither of them remembered anymore. She didn't ask him to leave. He chose to. Quietly, without words. Just like his letters had ended. A final silence. She didn't chase after Luca either. Not then. Not out of pride, but because she needed to know her next step wasn't a reaction. That it was hers, and hers alone. What lingered wasn't the betrayal. It was the realization that love, when broken, rarely returns to its original shape. And sometimes, the greatest betrayal is staying loyal to a version of someone that no longer exists. Weeks passed. The war ended, but peace didn't come with parades or confetti, it came with silence. Elena remained in the town, choosing to continue her work at the hospital. Life didn't rush to begin again, it unfolded slowly, like a wound learning to scar. Thomas sent one final letter before leaving for good. No apology. Just a note saying he was going back to his family's estate, where things were simpler. She didn't reply. Elena didn't feel relief or heartbreak, just a hollow kind of acceptance. The kind that doesn't ache, but lingers. She thought often about Luca. Whether he had made it south. Whether he had found what he was looking for. She had no address, no promise to hold on to. Only the weight of choice pressing quietly against her chest. People in town whispered. Some pitied her, others judged. A woman left by one man, loved by another, and now alone. She ignored them. She had lived in silence long enough to understand how to exist inside it. The hospital gave her purpose, but not distraction. In every face she treated, she saw traces of herself. Pieces pulled apart and rearranged by war, love, and time. One afternoon, she found herself writing. Not to Thomas. Not to Luca. Just to herself. A letter without a name, filled with truths she had avoided for years. She wrote about duty, about forgiveness, about the illusions of forever. She wrote about love that fades, and love that stays even when it shouldn't. About guilt that wasn't earned, and desire that wasn't shameful. She folded the letter neatly and placed it with the others. Not as part of the past, but as a marker of her beginning. There was no dramatic closure. No final kiss or confrontation. Just space. Clean, open space where new life could fit. Elena didn't try to replace what she'd lost, she didn't need to. She had loved. She had been betrayed. And through it all, she had rediscovered herself. That was enough. When spring came, she walked past the riverbank alone, the same one Thomas had written about in his letters. The trees were blooming again, unaware of all the pain they had watched. She didn't cry. She didn't pause. She simply walked, steady and unafraid. In her home, the drawer that once held Thomas's letters was now empty. She had burned them one by one, not in anger, but as a farewell. The flames didn't erase the past, but they released it. Letting go wasn't an act of forgetting, it was choosing not to carry weight that no longer belonged. Elena stood at the edge of everything she had known, not waiting for anyone. Not bound by a name, a ring, or a promise. She wasn't defined by betrayal or by love lost. She was her own ending and her own beginning. And for the first time, that was more than enough.